Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Eureka Springs, Arkansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The hills of northern Arkansas hold many secrets. Some are carried away by the whisper of wind through ancient oak trees. Others remain buried, only to resurface when the soil is disturbed. This is one such story, unearthed from county records, newspaper clippings, and personal journals dating back to the aftermath of the American Civil War. In the spring of 1865, as the nation struggled to heal its wounds, Eureka Springs was little more than a collection of structures nestled among the Ozark Mountains. The natural springs that gave the town its name attracted visitors seeking healing, but for one resident, the waters offered no comfort from what she had witnessed. This is the account of Margaret Holloway, a widow whose peculiar behavior following a gruesome discovery would perplex the community and ultimately lead to one of the region's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. The Holloway residence stood approximately 3 miles east of the main springs, along what is now East Mountain Drive. It was a modest 2-story house built of local timber with a wide porch that wrapped around the eastern side, offering views of the valley below. County property records indicate the house was constructed in 1859, just before the outbreak of the war. The location was deliberately isolated, set back from the dirt road that connected Eureka Springs to Berryville, obscured by a grove of hickory trees. According to the 1860 census, the household consisted of Margaret, age 32, her husband Thomas Holloway, age 37, and their housekeeper, Abigail Fletcher, age 51. There is no record of any children. Thomas Holloway was listed as a merchant of dry good with a modest but comfortable income. Local newspaper accounts describe him as a respected businessman and quiet man of orderly habits. Before settling in Eureka Springs, Thomas had operated a small but successful mercantile in St. Louis. His decision to relocate to the relative isolation of the Ozarks raised eyebrows among his business associates. A letter preserved in the Missouri Historical Society, written by one James Hargrove to his brother in 1858, mentions this curious choice. Holloway has sold his interests here and purchased land in Arkansas, of all places. Claims the mountain air will benefit his wife's constitution, though she has never, to my knowledge, displayed any ailment. Between us, I suspect he wishes to remove himself from certain entanglements that have developed here. He departs next month with his wife and household. The nature of these entanglements remains speculative, though subsequent discoveries suggest they may have been romantic rather than financial. What is known with certainty is that Thomas established his new mercantile in Eureka Springs by early 1859, importing goods from St. Louis and selling them at a modest profit to the local community. Margaret's background before her marriage is less documented. County records indicate she was born Margaret Eliza Thornfield in Nashville, Tennessee in 1833, the daughter of a school teacher. She married Thomas Holloway in 1855 in St. Louis, where she was reportedly employed as a seamstress. Acquaintances described her as reserved but pleasant, accomplished in household arts, and devoted to her husband. This last characterization would take on a darker significance in light of later events. The Holloways appeared, by all accounts, to live a quiet and respectable life during their first years in Eureka Springs. They attended the Methodist Church regularly. Thomas was known to extend credit to families struggling during the war years. Margaret participated in ladies' aid societies, sewing uniforms and bandages for Confederate soldiers. Nothing in these early records suggests the darkness that would later envelop the household. On April 18, 1865, just days after the assassination of President Lincoln, Thomas Holloway was found dead in the root cellar of their home. The Carroll County Gazette reported that Mr. Holloway's body was discovered in a state that suggested a violent struggle had preceded his demise. The same article noted that Mrs. Holloway was overcome with a nervous disposition upon discovery of her husband's remains. What the newspaper failed to mention was the beginning of Margaret's peculiar behavior, which would come to define her in the months and years that followed. According to the initial report filed by Deputy Sheriff William Garner, it was Margaret herself who found the body. Her account, as recorded by Garner, stated that Thomas had gone to check the preservation of winter stores in the root cellar the previous evening and had not returned. Upon searching for him the following morning, she discovered him lying at the foot of the cellar steps, apparently having fallen and struck his head on the stone floor. This explanation was accepted without significant investigation. The initial investigation was cursory at best. The county had only recently emerged from the turmoil of the Civil War. Law enforcement resources were stretched thin, and the death of one merchant, while tragic, was not considered a priority. The county sheriff's report, preserved in the Carroll County Historical Society archives, states only that death appears to have resulted from blunt trauma to the head and upper torso. No suspects were named. No arrests were made. The case was effectively closed before it began. What we now know, thanks to the medical examiner's notes rediscovered in 1960, is that Thomas Holloway's injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall. Dr. Miles Rothschild, who examined the body before burial, noted multiple contusions to the cranium radiating from distinct points of impact, defensive wounds evident on forearms and hands. These injuries suggest the deceased attempted to shield himself from repeated blows, delivered with considerable force. Most curious is a narrow, penetrating wound to the throat region, precise in nature, unlike the blunt trauma evident elsewhere. These observations, had they been properly investigated at the time, might have altered the course of events significantly. Instead, they remained buried in Dr. Rothschild's personal papers until nearly a century later, by which time those involved were long deceased. Margaret Holloway did not protest this negligence. In fact, according to Abigail Fletcher's journal discovered in 1952 during the renovation of the old Holloway property, Margaret seemed strangely resigned. An entry dated April 25, 1865 reads, "Mrs. H. has not shed a tear since the burial. She sits in the parlor, still as stone, staring at nothing. When I bring her tea, she thanks me in a voice that sounds hollow, like it's coming from the bottom of a well. She does not sleep in their bed any more." A subsequent entry, dated May 2nd, provides additional insight into Margaret's state of mind. "Found Mrs. H. in the master bedroom today, methodically removing all of Mr. H.'s possessions, his clothes, his shaving implements, even the books from his side of the bed, all packed away in trunks. When I inquired what she intended to do with these items, she replied, 'They must be preserved exactly as they are.' The trunks now sit in the attic, locked, with Mrs. H. keeping the keys on a chain around her neck. The community extended the expected sympathies to the new widow. Neighbors brought food. The pastor of the First Methodist Church called regularly. But as spring turned to summer, those visits became less frequent, and Margaret's isolation deepened. She dismissed Abigail Fletcher in June, insisting she could manage the household alone. This decision raised eyebrows among the townsfolk, but it was her next action that truly began to unsettle the community. According to multiple accounts recorded in the journal of Dr. James Wilford, the town physician, Margaret Holloway began to visit the root cellar where her husband's body had been discovered, not occasionally, but daily, sometimes multiple times per day. Mrs. Holloway requested a new lock for the cellar door, wrote Dr. Wilford in July 1865. When I inquired as to the reason, she stated simply that she wished to control access to the space. I observed that her fingernails were dirty, as if she had been digging in soil. Dr. Wilford's concern prompted him to make regular professional calls to the Holloway residence throughout the summer and autumn of 1865. His journal contains detailed observations of Margaret's deteriorating condition. Mrs. H. refuses to discuss her husband's passing, he noted on August 12th. When the subject is approached, she changes the topic to matters of household management or the weather. Yet I am informed by neighboring farmers that light can be seen in the root cellar at all hours of the night. What occupation keeps her there remains a mystery she will not illuminate. The cellar itself was a small space, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, dug partially into the hillside beneath the house. Stone steps led down from an external door at the rear of the property. It was cool year-round, ideal for storing root vegetables and preserves. After Thomas's death, neighbors reported that Margaret ceased using it for its intended purpose. Yet she continued to enter it daily, sometimes remaining inside for hours. Sarah Pembroke, whose family owned the adjacent property, described watching Margaret from a distance. She would walk out to the cellar in the morning, unlock the door, and disappear inside. Sometimes she carried a lantern, sometimes not. She would emerge much later, often when the sun was already setting. Her dress would be soiled at the knees, as if she had been kneeling on the dirt floor. She never acknowledged me, though she must have known I could see her from our land. In a letter to her sister in Memphis, dated September 1865, Sarah elaborated on these observations. The widow Holloway has become an object of speculation among our neighbors. Yesterday, Reverend Aldridge called upon her, hoping to persuade her to rejoin the congregation. He reported afterward that she received him politely, but dismissed his concerns. When he inquired directly about her frequent visits to the root cellar, she replied that she found the solitude clarifying. Most disturbing was her parting comment. As the Reverend was leaving, she reportedly said, "We are never truly alone, are we, Reverend? The dead have so much to tell us, if only we will listen." The good Reverend was quite unsettled by this remark. By autumn of that year, Margaret had become increasingly reclusive. She no longer attended church services. She had her supplies delivered by a local boy, paying him extra to leave the packages on the porch without knocking. The only person reported to have regular contact with her was Dr. Wilford, who continued to call on her professionally, concerned about her mental state. "Mrs. Holloway exhibits symptoms consistent with melancholia," he wrote in September. "Her appearance has deteriorated. She has lost considerable weight. Her hair, once kept in a neat arrangement, now hangs loose and uncombed. Most concerning is her preoccupation with the sight of her husband's demise. When questioned directly, she claims she is listening in the cellar. When asked what she hears, she will not respond." On October 3, 1865, Dr. Wilford made a troubling discovery during his weekly visit. "Upon arrival, I found Mrs. Holloway absent from the house. The door was unlocked, which is unusual given her increasing reclusiveness. I took the liberty of examining the premises, concerned for her welfare. In the kitchen, I observed a pile of soiled clothing, dresses and undergarments, stained with what appeared to be soil. More concerning was a drawer left open in the sideboard, containing a collection of small objects, a man's cufflink, a pipe bowl, fragments of what looked like bone, though perhaps from a chicken or similar fowl, and a small vial of dark liquid that gave off a metallic odor when unstoppered. These items were arranged in a pattern suggesting deliberate placement rather than casual storage. I did not disturb them, but noted their presence with some disquiet. Dr. Wilford reported his concerns to Reverend Aldridge, who in turn consulted with the county sheriff. The three men agreed that while Margaret's behavior was unusual, it did not constitute grounds for formal intervention. "The lady is in mourning," the sheriff is quoted as saying. "Folks cope with grief in different ways. So long as she harms no one, her peculiarities are her own affair." This hands-off approach might have seemed reasonable at the time, particularly in a community recovering from the disruptions of war. In retrospect, it allowed a potentially dangerous situation to develop unchecked. On October 31, 1865, a date that would later take on symbolic significance in the minds of those studying the case, Margaret Holloway placed an unusual order with the local mercantile. The receipt, preserved in county records, lists the following items: 5 pounds salt, 1 gallon vinegar, 3 yards muslin cloth, 1 iron garden trowel, 1 padlock with key. The combination of these items raised no concerns at the time, but would later be interpreted as evidence of planning rather than random purchasing. The winter of 1865-1866 was particularly harsh in the Ozarks. Heavy snowfall isolated many outlying properties, including the Holloway residence. For nearly 6 weeks, no one from town was able to reach Margaret. When the roads finally cleared in late January, Dr. Wilford made a wellness visit, only to find something that disturbed him greatly. The cellar door stood open despite the snow, he recorded. Inside, I discovered evidence that Mrs. Holloway had been excavating the dirt floor. A significant depression, nearly 3 feet deep, had been dug in the center of the space. Tools, a shovel, and a garden trowel lay nearby. Mrs. Holloway herself was sitting on the steps, seemingly unaffected by the cold. When questioned about her activities, she stated only that she was making room. For what, she would not say. Dr. Wilford noted additional concerning observations during this visit. The house itself was in disarray, quite unlike Mrs. Holloway's previous standards of housekeeping. Dishes were unwashed. Clothing lay where it had been discarded. A fire had not been lit in the main hearth for some time, judging by the cold ash. Most troubling was the state of the parlor. The furniture had been pushed to the walls, creating an open space in the center of the room. On the wooden floor, scratched apparently with a nail or similar implement, was a crude diagram resembling a human form with lines radiating from the head and chest. When I inquired about this marking, Mrs. Holloway covered it with a rug and refused to discuss it. Dr. Wilford's concern prompted him to consult with Reverend Thomas Aldridge of the Methodist Church. Together, they agreed that Margaret's behavior warranted intervention. On February 3, 1866, they returned to the property with the intention of persuading Margaret to stay with the Reverend's family in town, at least until spring. What they found has been documented in multiple sources, including Dr. Wilford's journal, Reverend Aldridge's correspondence with the Regional Methodist Conference, and a subsequent article in the Carroll County Gazette. All accounts agree on the essential details, though they differ in their interpretations. The house was unlocked but empty. A fire had been lit in the hearth, but had burned down to embers. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the kitchen table. Margaret's coat still hung by the door. The two men searched the property, eventually making their way to the root cellar. The padlock had been removed, and the door stood slightly ajar. Inside, they found the excavation had been expanded considerably. What had been a 3-foot depression was now a pit nearly 6 feet deep and 8 feet across, taking up most of the cellar floor. The dirt had been piled along the walls. Their lantern revealed something white at the bottom of the hole, a piece of fabric. Upon closer inspection, they discovered it was a nightgown, laid out flat as if someone were wearing it, though no body was present. Beside the garment lay several personal items: a hairbrush containing strands of dark hair, a wedding band, and a daguerreotype of Thomas Holloway. Most disturbing was a leather-bound journal, open to a page dated the previous day. The handwriting, identified as Margaret's, contained only a single line: "I hear him moving beneath the floor." Reverend Aldridge, in his letter to Bishop Whitaker, dated February 10, 1866, described his reaction to this discovery. "I confess, Your Grace, that I was overcome with a sensation of dread unlike any I have experienced in my years of ministry. It was not the fear of supernatural occurrence. I hold fast to our doctrine regarding the state of souls after death. Rather, it was the recognition of a human mind untethered from reason, capable of actions beyond normal contemplation. Dr. Wilford and I removed ourselves from the cellar with haste and summoned the sheriff from town. An extensive search of the surrounding area yielded no sign of Margaret Holloway. The county sheriff organized a party of volunteers who combed the hills for 3 days. Dogs were brought in to track her scent, but they lost the trail near Leatherwood Creek, approximately 1 mile south of the property. The prevailing theory was that she had fallen into the creek, which was swollen with winter runoff, and drowned. Her body was never recovered. This conclusion, however, was challenged by several pieces of evidence that emerged during the search. Margaret's winter boots were found neatly placed by the back door of the house. If she had fled or fallen into the creek, what footwear had she worn? Additionally, a routine inventory of her possessions revealed that a small valise was missing, along with several items of clothing and a modest amount of cash from a tin box kept in her bedroom. Most significant was the discovery made by a search party member named Joseph Parkins. Approximately 2 miles from the Holloway property, along a seldom-used trail leading toward Berryville, Parkins found a small campsite. The remains of a fire, still warm, and fragments of food suggested someone had rested there recently. Nearby, partially concealed by fallen leaves, was a woman's handkerchief embroidered with the initials M.H. This evidence suggested not an accidental drowning, but a deliberate departure, one planned and executed with care. The sheriff, however, was reluctant to expand the search further or to classify Margaret as a fugitive. With no clear crime established and limited resources at his disposal, he officially declared her missing, presumed deceased, on February 15, 1866. The case might have faded into obscurity, remembered only as a tragic footnote in local history, were it not for what was discovered during the renovation of the property in 1952. The Holloway house had changed hands multiple times over the decades. By the mid-20th century, it had fallen into disrepair and was purchased by a developer planning to restore it as a historic guest house. Workers removing the degraded wooden floor of the root cellar made a shocking discovery. Approximately 4 feet below the original dirt floor, they uncovered human remains. Initial assumption was that they had found Margaret Holloway at last. Forensic examination, however, revealed something else entirely. The remains were those of a male, estimated to be in his late 30s or early 40s. More significantly, the skull showed evidence of multiple fractures consistent with blunt force trauma. Most telling was a gold pocket watch found among the remains, engraved with the initials T.H., Thomas Holloway. The coroner's report, dated June 12, 1952, provided disturbing details about the condition of the remains. Subject appears to have been buried in a seated position, knees drawn up to chest, arms bound behind back with what remnants suggest was a leather belt. Fabric fragments consistent with a man's suit of 1860s fashion surround the remains. Of particular note is the presence of a narrow, pointed object embedded in the cervical vertebrae. Appears to be the broken tip of a metal implement, possibly a letter opener or similar instrument. Death would have resulted from either this penetrating wound or from the extensive cranial trauma evident in multiple fracture patterns across the skull. This discovery contradicted the official record. According to the county death certificate and cemetery records, Thomas Holloway had been buried in the Eureka Springs Cemetery on April 20th, 1865. His grave marker still stands in the old section of the cemetery, yet here were his remains, buried secretly beneath the floor of his own root cellar. The investigation that followed raised more questions than it answered. Exhumation of the grave in the cemetery revealed a coffin filled with rocks and soil, approximately the weight of an adult male. Someone, presumably Margaret, had staged a false burial while keeping her husband's actual remains hidden on their property. But why? And what had happened to Margaret? The answers may lie in a collection of letters discovered in the attic of the property during the same renovation. The correspondence between Thomas Holloway and a woman in St. Louis, identified only as E, suggested a lengthy affair and plans for Thomas to leave Eureka Springs and his wife in the spring of 1865. My dearest E read the most revealing of these letters, dated March 10, 1865. The preparations are nearly complete. I have converted sufficient assets to provide for our comfortable departure. M suspects nothing, believing my frequent absences are related to business concerns. By month's end, I shall be free to join you in St. Louis, where we may proceed with our plans unencumbered. The property here will be sold, of course, though I expect little remorse at leaving this isolated place. I count the days until we are reunited. This letter was never sent. It was found in Thomas's desk drawer, sealed but unaddressed. Whether Margaret discovered it before or after her husband's death remains unknown, though the timing suggests she may have found it, confronted him, and, in a moment of rage or calculated vengeance, ended his life on the very night he planned to leave her. Had Margaret discovered this betrayal? Had confrontation led to violence? The evidence suggests this possibility, but without Margaret's testimony, certainty remains elusive. What is clear is that whatever occurred in that root cellar in April 1865 haunted Margaret Holloway, drawing her back repeatedly to the scene, compelling her to dig, to listen, perhaps to speak to the man she had once loved, now concealed beneath the earth. The psychological dimension of this case fascinated Dr. Robert Chambers, a psychiatrist who reviewed the evidence in 1954 as part of a study on historical cases of mental illness. What we see in Margaret Holloway's behavior, he wrote, is consistent with a phenomenon now recognized as repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to revisit the scene of a traumatic event. More disturbing is the ritualistic nature of her activities in the cellar. The digging, the arrangement of personal items, the claim that she was listening, these suggest not merely guilt, but an ongoing relationship with the deceased. In her mind, Thomas was not gone, but transformed, still present beneath the soil, still capable of communication. This analysis takes on additional significance in light of what was discovered during the archaeological survey of the property in 1965. Ground-penetrating radar revealed that the area beneath the root cellar floor contained not one, but multiple disturbances in the soil, areas where digging had occurred and material had been replaced. These disturbances formed a pattern radiating outward from the central grave site, like spokes from a wheel. When excavated, these secondary sites contained various items, pieces of Thomas's clothing, pages from his business ledger, personal effects including his pipe and shaving kit. Each item had been carefully wrapped in muslin cloth, positioned at a precise distance and direction from the main burial. Dr. Chambers, reviewing these findings shortly before his death in 1967, suggested that Margaret had been engaged in a form of sympathetic magic, a ritualistic dispersal of her husband's possessions intended to contain or control his spirit. Not in a supernatural sense, Chambers clarified, but as a psychological mechanism. By distributing these objects, she was perhaps attempting to diffuse the intense focus of her guilt or fear, to spread it to manageable proportions. The final piece of this macabre puzzle emerged in 1968, when an elderly woman in a nursing home in Fayetteville, Arkansas, claimed to have information about the Holloway case. Ida Mae Collins, age 93, told a local historian that her mother had worked as a housekeeper for a woman in Berryville in the 1870s and 1880s. This woman, who called herself Mary Smith, had arrived in town with no family and few possessions sometime in 1866. According to Collins, her mother had once discovered her employer in a disturbing state. Mama found her in the root cellar of the house, digging at the dirt floor with her bare hands, Collins recalled. When asked what she was doing, the woman said she was checking to make sure he was still there. Mama didn't ask who he was. She didn't want to know. Collins further recalled that this Mary Smith wore a locket containing a small daguerreotype of a man. She never spoke of him, never mentioned a husband or past life. She lived quietly, keeping to herself, until her death from pneumonia in 1891. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the Berryville Cemetery. The strangest thing, Collins added during her interview, was what Mama found after Miss Mary died. Under the floorboards in her bedroom was a small wooden box. Inside was a man's pocket watch, a wedding ring too large for a woman's hand, and a journal. Mama couldn't read, but she kept those items, feeling they might be important to someone. They were still in her possession when she passed in 1912. What became of them after that, I couldn't say. The historian, intrigued by this account, searched county records for information about this Mary Smith. He found property tax records indicating that she had indeed purchased a small house on the outskirts of Berryville in 1868. paying cash. The house had been demolished in the 1920s to make way for a commercial building. No photograph of Mary Smith has ever been located, nor any document bearing her signature that might be compared to Margaret Holloway's known handwriting. Was Mary Smith actually Margaret Holloway? The timing of her arrival in Berryville, just 20 miles from Eureka Springs, certainly suggests this possibility. Her behavior, particularly her compulsion to dig in the root cellar, mirrors what we know of Margaret. Yet without definitive evidence, this connection remains speculative. In 1969, a different line of investigation emerged when researchers at the University of Arkansas discovered a series of anonymous letters published in the Berryville Gazette between 1870 and 1872. These letters, signed only "A Concerned Christian," addressed moral and ethical issues facing the community. Literary analysis of the writing style suggests they may have been written by the same person who penned entries in Margaret Holloway's known journal. One letter in particular stands out for its relevance to the case. What obligation does one who has witnessed evil bear to the community? Must all sins be confessed to be forgiven? There are transgressions so profound that speaking them aloud would only spread their corruption rather than diminish it. Some burdens must be carried silently, known only to the bearer and to God. The weight of such knowledge is punishment enough for any mortal soul. If these were indeed Margaret's words, they offer a rare glimpse into her state of mind years after the events at the root cellar. A woman still grappling with guilt, still seeking moral justification for actions she could neither undo nor fully acknowledge. What we know with certainty is this: Thomas Holloway died violently in the spring of 1865. His body was concealed beneath the floor of his own root cellar, while an empty coffin was buried in the cemetery. His widow visited the true burial site repeatedly, perhaps driven by guilt, perhaps by some other emotion we cannot name. And then she vanished, possibly to reinvent herself elsewhere, possibly to meet her end in the cold waters of Leatherwood Creek. The Holloway house still stands, though it never opened as the guest house the developers envisioned. After the discoveries of 1952, the property changed hands again. Subsequent owners reported an unusual atmosphere in the root cellar. Not supernatural occurrences, but a heaviness, a sense of being watched. Most kept the space locked and unused. Richard Morgan, who owned the property from 1970 to 1982, described his experience. It wasn't anything you could put your finger on, no ghostly apparitions or strange sounds. Just a feeling that the space wasn't empty, even when you were alone there. My dog refused to enter the cellar, would sit at the top of the steps and whine. After a while, I stopped using it altogether. Wasn't worth the discomfort. In 1965, exactly 1 century after Thomas Holloway's death, a team from the University of Arkansas conducted an archaeological survey of the property. Using ground-penetrating radar, they discovered something unusual. The earth beneath the root cellar floor had been disturbed not just in the center where Thomas's remains were found, but in multiple locations throughout the space. Additional excavation revealed nothing. No more bodies, no artifacts of significance, just empty holes, meticulously dug and carefully refilled. Dr. Eleanor Simmons, the archaeologist who led the survey, noted in her report, "The pattern of excavation suggests ritualistic rather than practical purpose. The main burial is surrounded by 7 satellite disturbances, each approximately 2 feet in diameter and 3 feet deep. These secondary sites form a roughly circular pattern around the central grave. Carbon dating of organic material found in these holes indicates they were created in the same general time frame, the mid-1860s. What is most curious is that each hole appears to have been dug, filled with some material now decayed beyond identification, then carefully covered and the surface smoothed over. This suggests not a single event, but a series of activities carried out over time, with great attention to concealment. What was Margaret searching for in those long hours spent alone in the darkness? Was she checking her husband's resting place, ensuring her secret remained undisturbed? Was she speaking to him, seeking forgiveness or justifying her actions? Or was she listening, as she told Dr. Wilford, listening for something only she could hear? An 1864 diary entry by Margaret found among her possessions after her disappearance may offer a clue to her state of mind even before Thomas's death. "I dreamed last night that T was speaking to me from behind a wall. I could hear his voice clearly, but could not make out the words. When I pressed my ear to the plaster, the sound moved elsewhere. All night I followed this voice through the house, never seeing him, never understanding what he wished to tell me. Upon waking, I found him sleeping peacefully beside me. Yet the sensation remains that there is something he is not saying, some truth concealed behind his waking face." This entry, written months before Thomas's death, suggests that Margaret already sensed her husband's deception, his plans to abandon her. Perhaps her later claim that she could hear him beneath the cellar floor was a continuation of this earlier suspicion, a belief that in death Thomas would finally reveal the truths he had concealed in life. The case of Margaret Holloway and the root cellar stands as a testament to the darkness that can reside within the human heart. No ghosts walked the halls of that house in the Ozarks. No supernatural force drove a widow to obsession. The horror was entirely human: betrayal, violence, guilt, and the psychological toll of carrying an unspeakable secret. Today the property is privately owned and not open to the public. The current residents have sealed the root cellar entrance, preferring not to use the space. Local historians occasionally request access for research purposes, but such requests are rarely granted. The story, however, endures, passed down through generations, documented in academic papers, whispered among those who study the darker corners of American history. Some residents of modern Eureka Springs claim that on quiet nights, particularly in early spring when the air is still cold, you can hear the sound of digging coming from the direction of the old Holloway property. Skeptics attribute this to the active wildlife in the area or to the acoustics of the valley carrying normal sounds from elsewhere. Those familiar with the story know better than to investigate too closely. For in the end, the true horror of Margaret Holloway's story lies not in any supernatural element, but in its plausibility. How well do we know those closest to us? What secrets might lie beneath the floorboards of the houses we pass every day? And what compulsions might drive us if pushed beyond the boundaries of normal human endurance? The Carroll County Historical Society maintains a small exhibition related to the case, including photographs of the property, copies of Dr. Wilford's journal entries, and the daguerreotype found with Thomas Holloway's remains. Visitors often comment on Thomas's expression in the image, a slight smile that doesn't reach his eyes, as if he too carried secrets he'd never intended to share. As for Margaret, no confirmed image of her exists. The county records office has a marriage certificate with her signature, a flowing script with unusual precision. The last official document bearing her name is a property tax receipt from January 1866. After that, there is only absence, speculation, and the unsettling possibility that she lived on for decades, carrying the weight of her actions, perhaps still listening for something beneath the floor. In 1963, during the celebration of Eureka Springs' centennial, an elderly woman visited the Historical Society exhibition. According to the docent on duty, she stood for a long time before the display about the Holloway case, particularly studying the map showing the location of the property. Before leaving, she asked a single question: did they ever look under the floorboards of the main house? When the docent admitted they had not, the woman nodded, as if confirming something to herself, and departed. She did not leave her name, and no one thought to follow her. This incident prompted renewed interest in the case among local historians. In 1964, with permission from the property owners, a limited excavation was conducted beneath the floorboards of what had been the master bedroom in the Holloway house. No human remains were discovered, but workers did uncover a small tin box containing several items: a man's gold cufflink, a lock of dark hair tied with blue ribbon, and a folded piece of paper. The paper, when carefully opened, revealed a list of dates, beginning with April 18, 1865, the day Thomas Holloway's body was discovered, and continuing at monthly intervals until February 2, 1866, the day before Margaret disappeared. Beside each date was a single word: visited. Was this Margaret's record of her compulsive returns to the root cellar? A tally of conversations with her buried husband? Or something more sinister, a chronicle of additional actions taken after the initial burial, perhaps further concealment or desecration? Without Margaret's testimony, these questions remain unanswerable. One of the more disturbing theories to emerge in recent years comes from forensic psychologist Dr. Rachel Winters, who studied the case in 2010. What if the listening Margaret spoke of was not metaphorical, Dr. Winters posits. The manner in which Thomas was buried, seated upright rather than laid flat, suggests a specific intention. In certain historical cultures, this position was reserved for those who were feared might return, allowing them to rise more easily if they did. Is it possible that Margaret, in some distorted state of mind, believed her husband was still alive beneath the earth? That she was not merely listening for spiritual communication, but for literal sounds of movement? This theory, while speculative, aligns with some of Margaret's recorded statements. Her journal entry about hearing him moving beneath the floor takes on a more disturbing dimension if read literally rather than as an expression of guilt or psychological projection. So, too, does her statement to Dr. Wilford that she was making room in the cellar, perhaps not for additional burial, but for Thomas's imagined emergence. The psychological horror of this interpretation: a woman who killed her husband but could not accept his death, who buried him in a way that preserved the possibility of return, who listened daily for signs of that impossible resurrection, speaks to the profound disintegration of Margaret's mental state following her actions. Some stories end. Others simply pause, waiting for the next chapter to reveal itself when the time is right. The case of Margaret Holloway, the widow who couldn't stop visiting the crime scene, remains open, its final pages yet to be written. The root cellar still exists, sealed though it may be. The excavations remain undisturbed beneath the packed earth, and somewhere, perhaps, Margaret's secret waits to be discovered by someone willing to dig deep enough to uncover the truth. Listen carefully on your next visit to Eureka Springs. In the silence between the tourist attractions and quaint shops, you might hear it, the soft, persistent sound of a shovel breaking soil, of a woman working alone in the darkness, ensuring that what lies buried stays that way. Not a ghost story. Something far more disturbing: the echo of human actions across time, the resonance of secrets that refuse to remain hidden forever. The historian who interviewed Ida Mae Collins in 1968 made one final note in his report, subsequently filed with the Arkansas Historical Commission. Collins had shared one last detail about the woman her mother had worked for, the woman who might have been Margaret Holloway. Mama said that every year, on the same day in April, Mary would take the day off. No one knew where she went. She would leave before dawn and return after dark. Her shoes would be caked with red clay, the kind you find in the hills around Eureka Springs, and she would be at peace for a while afterward, until the digging started again. Among the documents preserved in the Carroll County Courthouse is an inventory of the Holloway household, conducted as part of the probate process after both Thomas and Margaret were presumed deceased. The list is mundane: furniture, kitchenware, linens. One item, however, stands out: one silver-handled letter opener, location unknown. This detail might have remained unremarkable were it not for a notation in Dr. Wilford's journal from his examination of Thomas Holloway's body before burial. The wounds appear consistent with a narrow-pointed implement, he wrote, not unlike a letter opener or similar household object. The murder weapon, if indeed Thomas was murdered, was never found. Not in 1865, nor during the investigations of the 1950s and 1960s. Another small piece of the puzzle, lost to time: the root cellar of the Holloway house had an unusual feature, according to architectural surveys conducted in the 1950s. The space had been constructed with what appeared to be a drainage system, a series of narrow channels cut into the stone foundation, converging at a small opening that led to the hillside beyond. This design would have ensured that any liquid on the cellar floor would flow outward, away from the house. A practical consideration for a storage space prone to dampness, perhaps, or something else entirely. What interests me about this drainage system, noted architectural historian William Faulkner in his 1957 report, is that it appears to have been modified sometime after the original construction. The channels were deepened and widened, particularly those surrounding the central area where the remains were discovered. This modification would have required considerable effort, suggesting deliberate intention rather than casual maintenance. Was this Margaret's work undertaken during her long hours alone in the cellar? If so, what purpose did it serve? Was she ensuring that any evidence, blood, bodily fluids, would be carried away from the burial site? Or was there a more ritualistic dimension to this modification, a belief that certain essences needed to be channeled in specific directions? Margaret Holloway's financial records, maintained by the Eureka Springs Bank and now housed in the county archives, show an interesting pattern in the months following her husband's death. Regular withdrawals, modest in amount but consistent in timing, beginning in May 1865 and continuing until her disappearance. The bank manager's notes indicate that Margaret explained these as payments to a stonemason for repairs to the property. No mason in Eureka Springs or neighboring communities reported working at the Holloway house during this period. When investigators in the 1960s cross-referenced these withdrawals with Margaret's known activities, they discovered a correlation. Each withdrawal occurred the day before a full moon. The significance of this pattern remains unclear. Was Margaret adhering to some personal ritual or superstition? Was she paying someone else for services rendered, perhaps assistance with her excavations in the root cellar? Or was there a practical reason for this timing that has been lost to history? When the property was surveyed in 1965, archaeological evidence suggested that the root cellar floor had been methodically excavated and refilled at least 3 times between 1865 and 1866. The soil layers showed distinct stratification, with the lowest level containing fragments of what experts identified as a wool suit fabric common in men's attire of the period. Above this, separated by layers of soil, were traces of other materials, cotton cloth, paper, what appeared to be leather from a book binding, as if someone had buried items at different depths, perhaps returning periodically to ensure they remained undisturbed. Dr. Louis Simmons's report on these findings included a disturbing observation. The careful layering of materials suggests not panic or haste but methodical action. This was not a single burial hastily conducted, but a series of deposits made over time. The individual responsible returned repeatedly to the site, adding new materials, perhaps removing others. This behavior is consistent with what psychologists might term processing trauma through ritualistic behavior, a way of working through overwhelming emotions or memories by converting them into physical actions. A report filed by a land surveyor in 1870, when the property was first sold after Margaret's disappearance, noted an anomaly in the terrain approximately 50 yards south of the house. A depression in the earth, circular in shape, approximately 8 feet in diameter. The soil appears to have been disturbed and subsequently settled. Local reports suggest a well was begun at this location, but abandoned. No evidence of well construction was found during later investigations. The depression was no longer visible by the time of the next survey in 1891. In 2012, using advanced ground-penetrating radar technology, archaeologists revisited this site. They discovered evidence of a large pit, roughly the dimensions described in the 1870 report. Excavation revealed no human remains or significant artifacts, but the soil composition was unusual. Layers of different types of earth, as if material had been brought from elsewhere and deposited here. Analysis showed that some of this soil matched samples taken from the root cellar, suggesting a connection between the two sites. The Journal of Reverend Aldridge, discovered among church records in the 1970s, contains an entry from December 1865 that sheds additional light on Margaret's mental state in the months before her disappearance. Called upon Mrs. Holloway today, he wrote, found her in a state of unusual agitation. She spoke at length about justice, though in terms I found difficult to follow. When I inquired if she felt some injustice had been done to her, she replied, "Not to me, by me." I urged her to unburden herself through prayer and confession, but she declined, saying some sins were beyond forgiveness. I fear for her soul. This rare acknowledgment of wrongdoing, "not to me, by me," suggests that Margaret was not entirely delusional or dissociated from her actions. She recognized that she had committed some transgression requiring justice. Yet her refusal to confess, her belief that her sins were beyond forgiveness, indicates she had chosen a different path toward atonement, a private ritual of returning, digging, listening that would continue until her disappearance and perhaps beyond. In 1967, as part of a historical research project, the University of Arkansas obtained permission to examine Thomas Holloway's business records, which had been preserved in the state archives. The ledgers revealed that in the months leading up to his death, Thomas had begun liquidating assets and transferring funds to a bank in St. Louis. By April 1865, he had amassed a considerable sum, equivalent to several years' income. This money was never accounted for after his death. It was not in any of his known accounts, nor was it found on the property. Margaret, despite becoming a widow of seemingly modest means, never appeared to struggle financially until her disappearance. Where had this money gone? Had Margaret discovered it, perhaps along with evidence of her husband's planned abandonment, and used it to finance her own eventual escape? Or had it already been sent to the mysterious E in St. Louis, funding a new life that Thomas would never live to enjoy? Records from the Saint. Louis Merchants Bank, examined in the 1970s, show that an account in the name of Elizabeth Hargrove received a substantial deposit on April 10, 1865, just 8 days before Thomas Holloway's body was discovered. The timing suggests that Thomas had indeed transferred funds to his presumed lover shortly before his death. The account was closed on May 1, 1865, with all funds withdrawn. No further trace of Elizabeth Hargrove appears in St. Louis records after this date. Could this woman, the E from Thomas's letters, have been involved in his death? Might she have traveled to Eureka Springs, confronted him, perhaps even participated in whatever violence occurred in the root cellar? The evidence is circumstantial at best, but the possibility adds another layer to an already complex case. One of the most curious items discovered during the 1952 renovation was a small tin box, rusted but intact, concealed in the space between the root cellar ceiling and the floorboards of the room above. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing columns of numbers arranged in pairs. Cryptographers from the university were unable to determine if this was a code or cipher of some kind. The paper's age was consistent with the 1860s, but its purpose remains unknown. Was it a record of some kind, an inventory, or something more sinister, a tally perhaps, with its own dark meaning? Professor James Morrison of the University of Arkansas Mathematics Department studied this document in the 1980s. The pattern suggests more than random notation, he observed. The numbers appear in consistent groupings, pairs of two-digit numbers separated by spaces, with each line containing exactly 7 pairs. The left number in each pair is always less than 30, while the right number ranges between 1 and 12. This structure is suggestive of dates, days, and months, though the sequence doesn't follow a chronological order. If these were indeed dates, what significance did they hold for Margaret? Were they appointments, anniversaries, deadlines? Or were they a code for something else entirely, locations perhaps, or quantities of some unspecified items? Without a key to this potential cipher, the meaning remains elusive. The original sheriff's report from 1865 contained testimony from a farmhand who had been passing the Holloway property on the night of April 17th, the presumed date of Thomas's death. The man reported hearing raised voices coming from the direction of the house, followed by a silence so complete it was like the world had stopped. He thought nothing of it at the time, assuming it was a marital disagreement that had resolved itself. Only after news of Thomas's death spread did he come forward with this information. By then, of course, it was too late for a proper investigation. This witness, identified as Jeremiah Watts, provided additional details in a subsequent statement given to the county clerk on April 25, 1865. "It weren't just arguing I heard," he clarified. "There was a woman's voice, raised like in anger or fear, then a man's voice, lower but sharp-like, then a sound like furniture being moved sudden. After that came the silence. I mind it particular because my horse spooked at that moment like something had startled it. I had to calm it before moving on." Watts estimated the time of these sounds as around 9 of the evening, just as full dark was settling. This timing aligns with the estimated time of death determined by Dr. Rothschild's examination, placing Thomas Holloway's demise between 8 and 10 o'clock on the evening of April 17th. In the summer of 1964, during routine maintenance of the town cemetery, workers discovered something unusual beneath Thomas Holloway's headstone. The stone itself was typical for the period, a modest marble marker with his name, dates of birth and death, and a brief epitaph, "At rest." When the stone was temporarily removed to level the ground beneath it, workers found a small tin box, similar to the one discovered in the root cellar. This box, however, was empty save for a single word scratched into the metal interior: "Never." The discovery was reported to the Historical Society but not widely publicized. The box was preserved in the Society's collection, catalogued simply as Artifact Holloway Grave, 1964. Its presence raises intriguing questions. Who placed it there? When? And what did that single word "never" signify? A denial? A promise? A warning? If the box was placed by Margaret, it suggests she visited her husband's false grave at some point after his burial, perhaps as part of her complex ritual of remembrance and concealment. If placed by someone else, perhaps the mysterious E from St. Louis, it hints at a deeper layer to the story, connections and knowledge extending beyond what has been documented. Dr. Wilford's final entry regarding Margaret Holloway, dated January 28, 1866, just days before her disappearance, contains a passage that has puzzled historians for decades. "Mrs. H. spoke today of completion," he wrote. "She said her work was nearly done, that soon she would be joining him, though not in the way he expected." When pressed on this cryptic statement, she would say only that some journeys are circular, ending where they begin. I confess I find her manner increasingly concerning, yet she rebuffs all suggestions of removing to town or accepting additional household help. This statement, "joining him, though not in the way he expected," has been interpreted variously as a suicidal intention, a plan to flee to wherever Thomas had intended to go with his lover, or a more metaphysical concept of spiritual reunion. The phrase, "some journeys are circular, ending where they begin," suggests a return to origins, perhaps a contemplation of her own mortality, or a more concrete plan to revisit some significant location. The last known sighting of Margaret Holloway might not have been on February 2, 1866, as commonly believed. A stagecoach driver's log from February 10th of that year includes a brief notation: "Picked up lady passenger at crossroads near Leatherwood Creek. No baggage." Destination? Rogers. The description matches Margaret's general appearance, though the driver did not record the woman's name. Rogers, Arkansas, was a small settlement approximately 30 miles from Eureka Springs, a reasonable first stop for someone wishing to disappear without drawing attention. This log entry was discovered in the 1980s, during cataloging of transportation records at the State Archive. Its significance wasn't immediately recognized, but when cross-referenced with the Holloway case timeline, the correlation became apparent. If this was indeed Margaret, she had not drowned in Leatherwood Creek, but had deliberately staged her disappearance, perhaps even leaving evidence to suggest an accidental death while she escaped to build a new life elsewhere. In 1895, a woman matching Mary Smith's description, the woman believed by some to be Margaret Holloway, visited the Eureka Springs Cemetery on April 18th, the anniversary of Thomas's death. The groundskeeper's daily record notes an elderly lady in black standing at T. Holloway grave from morning till mid-afternoon, left flowers but no name. This would have been 30 years after Thomas's death. 30 years of carrying whatever burden drove her to return to this place of false burial. The groundskeeper, Curtis Beaumont, provided additional details in a later interview conducted in 1910 when he was in his 80s. She wasn't just standing there, he recalled. She was talking. Not loud, mind you, but steady, like she was carrying on a conversation. I didn't want to disturb her grief, so I kept my distance. But I remember thinking it strange, her speaking so much to a man, 30 years dead. When she finally left, I went to clear away the dead flowers from the day before, and I noticed something odd. The soil on the grave seemed freshly disturbed, just a little, like someone had been poking at it with a stick or maybe a finger. This behavior, speaking to a grave, disturbing the soil, mirrors Margaret's known activities at the root cellar. If this elderly visitor was indeed Margaret Mary, it suggests her compulsion had never fully abated. Even after 3 decades, she was still driven to return, to speak, to touch the earth covering her secret. The most recent development in this century-old mystery came in 1968, when a construction project on the eastern edge of Berryville uncovered what appeared to be a small private cemetery, unmarked and unrecorded in county records. Among the graves was one containing the remains of a woman estimated to have died in her late 50s or early 60s, sometime around 1890. Buried with the remains was a silver locket containing a daguerreotype of a man whose features, though degraded by time, bore a striking resemblance to the known images of Thomas Holloway. Most telling was an item clutched in the woman's right hand, a silver-handled letter opener, its tip broken off. Forensic examination of this letter opener revealed something significant. The broken tip matched precisely the metal fragment found embedded in Thomas Holloway's cervical vertebrae. The metal composition, the angle of the break, the dimensions, all aligned perfectly. This physical evidence provides the strongest connection yet between Mary Smith of Berryville and the death of Thomas Holloway. If this was indeed Margaret Holloway, she had carried the instrument of her crime, assuming she was responsible for Thomas's death, to her own grave. A final act of acknowledgement, perhaps, or a gesture of defiance, or simply the inability to part with the physical embodiment of the moment that had defined her existence from that point forward. The letter opener is now housed in the Arkansas State Historical Museum in Little Rock, cataloged simply as Silver Implement Origin Unknown, circa 1860s. Its connection to the Holloway case remains officially unconfirmed, though researchers familiar with the story know better. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this case is not what we know, but what remains hidden. The root cellar excavations conducted in the 1960s revealed that the disturbed areas of soil formed a distinct pattern, not random holes, but a deliberate arrangement. When mapped, the pattern resembled nothing so much as a human figure, arms and legs outstretched, approximately the size of an adult male. At the position corresponding to the heart was the deepest excavation, the place where Thomas Holloway's remains were discovered. Dr. Simmons, in her archaeological report, noted, "The symbolic implications of this pattern cannot be ignored. The burial site itself formed the heart of a human outline delineated by secondary excavations. Whether this arrangement was planned from the outset or evolved over time through repeated visitation remains unclear. What is evident is that the individual responsible, presumably Margaret Holloway, was engaged in a complex psychological process involving not just concealment but ritualistic interaction with the burial site. Margaret's compulsion to dig, to check, to listen speaks to something beyond mere guilt or fear of discovery. There is a ritualistic quality to her actions, as described by witnesses, a need to connect physically with the site of her transgression. The methodical refilling of the holes, the careful replacement of the soil, suggests not concealment, but preservation, as if the act itself, rather than its result, held significance for her. In the language of modern psychology, we might describe Margaret Holloway as suffering from obsessive-compulsive behaviors triggered by trauma, whether the trauma of losing her husband or the trauma of taking his life. But such clinical terminology fails to capture the human element of this story. A woman bound to a place by acts she could neither undo nor escape, compelled to return again and again to the physical location of her darkest moment. This compulsion, this inability to leave the scene of the crime is what resonates most deeply about Margaret's story. It speaks to a fundamental truth about human nature, that we are shaped not only by our actions, but by our reaction to those actions, by the ways in which we attempt to integrate our worst moments into our understanding of ourselves. If Margaret Holloway did indeed kill her husband, perhaps in response to his planned abandonment, her subsequent behavior suggests not a cold-blooded murderess, but a human being overwhelmed by the consequences of a moment of passion or desperation. Her repeated returns to the root cellar, her compulsive digging, her need to listen and to check, these speak not of evil, but of a fractured psyche, struggling to contain something too massive, too devastating to be processed through normal channels. And if she did live on as Mary Smith, continuing her pattern of cellar digging in a new location, we must wonder what she heard in those underground spaces. What voice called to her from beneath the earth? What conversation was she continuing with the man whose life she had ended? What absolution was she seeking that could never be granted? The true horror of Margaret Holloway's story lies in its psychological reality. No supernatural force compelled her actions. No curse or haunting drove her to return to the root cellar day after day, to dig in the earth with bloodied hands, to listen for sounds no one else could hear. The compulsion came from within, from the human capacity for obsession, for guilt, for the inability to escape one's own actions. In many ways, Margaret Holloway's story is a cautionary tale about the price of secrets. Thomas kept his plans hidden until they were discovered. Margaret concealed her response, whether murder or something else, beneath layers of soil and deception. Each secret birthed another, creating a cascade of concealment that ultimately consumed both their lives. Thomas physically buried in a hidden grave, Margaret psychologically trapped in a prison of her own making, compelled to return to the scene of her transgression until the end of her days. Today, the Holloway house stands renovated and modernized, its dark history known to its owners, but not dwelled upon. The root cellar has been sealed, its entrance concealed behind landscaping and decorative stonework. But the earth remembers. The ground holds the impression of Margaret's knees as she knelt, night after night, digging, listening, communing with whatever lay beneath. And perhaps somewhere, in a dimension beyond our understanding, Margaret Holloway still kneels in the cool darkness of that underground space, still listens for the voice that only she can hear, still seeks a resolution that will never come. Not a ghost story, something far more profound and disturbing, the eternal echo of a human action, reverberating across time, binding perpetrator to victim in a relationship that transcends even death. For the true lesson of the Holloway case is this: some crime scenes are never truly abandoned. Some visits never truly end. The physical location may change hands, may be renovated or demolished or reclaimed by nature, but in the landscape of human consciousness, the scene remains eternally accessible to those bound to it by their actions. Margaret Holloway couldn't stop visiting the crime scene because, in a very real sense, she had never left it. Her physical presence might move through the world, might even establish a new identity in a neighboring town, but her true self remained forever in that root cellar, kneeling in the dirt, listening for absolution that would never come. And perhaps that is the most terrifying prospect of all, that our darkest moments may bind us to their locations, not through supernatural means, but through the simple, inescapable mechanism of human psychology, that we may be compelled to return, again and again, to the scenes of our transgressions, seeking a resolution that remains forever beyond our grasp. The case of Margaret Holloway, the widow who couldn't stop visiting the crime scene, stands as a testament to this profound and disturbing truth. No ghosts, no monsters, just the human heart, capable of acts both tender and terrible, and the human mind, capable of creating hells from which there is no escape. Listen carefully then when you visit Eureka Springs. That sound you hear in the distance, that rhythmic scraping of metal against soil, is not the supernatural. It is something far more haunting, the echo of human compulsion, of guilt, of obsession. The sound of a woman who could not stop visiting the scene of her crime, could not stop digging, could not stop listening for a voice from beneath the earth. A voice that, perhaps, has never stopped speaking,